If you dive into the literature surrounding extreme mountaineering or deep sea diving, there is this one recurring, honestly, incredibly terrifying phenomenon that survival experts always warn you about.
Oh, yeah, the paradoxical undressing, or that final sensation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. When a human being is out there in the elements, just completely exposed, freezing to death, and their body is succumbing to profound late-stage hypothermia, there's a specific moment right before the end where the violent shivering just stops.
It just completely shuts down.
Right. The panic just completely fades away. You stop fighting the brutal cold of your environment, and suddenly you feel this overwhelming, almost euphoric sensation of warmth.
Like a false fire.
Yes. You feel perfectly at peace. You feel, well, comfortable.
It is a profoundly tragic and, well-documented biological paradox. What is happening internally is that the body's autonomic nervous system essentially just exhausts its reserves.
It just runs out of juice.
Exactly. The system just stops expending the kinetic energy required to fight the hostile environment. So the capillaries dilate, flushing cold blood back into the skin, which, creates that false sensation of warmth. The organism simply surrenders to the ambient temperature.
And that is the terrifying part.
Yeah.
Because to the untrained eye, or even to the poor person actually experiencing it out there on the ice, it feels like everything is finally fine, like the struggle is over.
Right, but to a medical professional or to a physicist, that feeling of perfect comfort isn't peace at all. It is the terminal stage of systemic failure. That profound comfort is the absolute final indicator that you are about to die.
Which brings us perfectly to the core framework of our analysis today. Welcome back to our exclusive 8-part deep dive for the Fsiis Research Group.
It's great to be back. We have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. And I am incredibly thrilled to have you, the listener, with us again. Because if you've been following along on this journey, you know that our overarching mission is to strip away the corporate mythology, right? To decode the absolute physical reality of human organization.
Yeah, we are moving past the theories and getting into the actual mechanics.
Exactly. Today is part 3, and we have an immense, potentially paradigm-shifting amount of material here. But first, let's build a quick continuity bridge for you, just so we know exactly where we are standing on this foundation.
That's a good idea, just to ground everyone.
So in part 1, we introduced this massive, almost incomprehensible number, the $9.6 trillion leak.
A staggering amount of capital.
Right. That is the amount of value actively draining out of the global economy every single year. And as we established, it is not theft, it's not a localized market crash, and it's not, currency fluctuation. It is pure physical waste heat.
Yes.
Then in part 2, we took a sledgehammer to what the researchers call the semantic void. We looked really closely at the spectacular WeWork disaster.
Which was just a masterclass in the semantic void.
It really was. We used it to expose how human resources, poetry, soft language, and corporate jargon don't just mask problems, they literally cause structural collapse by blinding leadership to physical reality.
We spent part 2 clearing away the linguistic hallucination, and the key takeaway there was that you simply cannot fix a mechanical, physical engine using poetry.
You cannot use vibes to generate torque.
Right, exactly. You can't.
Which brings us to today. Because now that the jargon has been completely cleared away, it is time to look under the hood. Today, we are exploring Chapter 3 of Juha Huttunen's groundbreaking work to understand what that $9.6 trillion leak is actually made of on like a molecular level.
And I have to warn you, the overarching thesis of this chapter is going to be incredibly difficult for a lot of modern managers to swallow.
Oh, absolutely. People are going to be mad.
They will be, because the core theme we have to establish right now is that the modern corporate obsession with workplace comfort, this relentless trillion-dollar drive to create perfectly balanced, stress-free environments, is a physical impossibility that mathematically guarantees the death of the enterprise.
Okay, let me stop you right there. I have to push back immediately on behalf of the listener. Wait a minute. Isn't making people comfortable the entire stated point of modern management?
Piece of what we've been told, yeah.
Right. I mean, for the last 20 years, every consulting firm, every LinkedIn thought leader, and every single leadership seminar has preached the exact same gospel. A happy, comfortable, stress-free employee is a productive employee.
The whole Silicon Valley model.
Exactly. We are told to build nap lounges, offer unlimited PTO, and eliminate pressure. So why are we suddenly applying brutal, literal physics to human beings and calling comfort a disease?
Because applying human resources poetry to complex systems has demonstrably mathematically failed. We aren't just theorizing here, we have the receipts.
The $9.6 trillion receipts.
Exactly. The global economy is hemorrhaging almost $10 trillion annually. The WeWork model, which was the absolute pinnacle of optimizing for vibes and comfort, collapsed into dust.
Right, the ping pong tables didn't save them.
No, they didn't. The sociological alchemy of trying to coax productivity out of people using meditation apps and forced synergy, it has resulted in a massive documented decline in actual kinetic output.
So what's the alternative?
To survive the current macroeconomic reality, the source material argues that we must abandon behavioral alchemy completely. We have to embrace organizational thermodynamics.
Organizational thermodynamics.
Yeah. We have to look at a company not as a family, not as a community center, but as a physical engine.
And to illustrate exactly what happens when you view a company as an engine, the text brings right back our recurring character, CEO 8.
Yes, from part 1.
Right. For those who remember, 8 is the executive of a massive $40 billion global logistics firm.
He is the archetype of the thermodynamic executive. He is the man who literally cuts the power to the boardroom projector when his executive team starts using buzzwords to hide their operational failures.
That's the guy. And Hypothermia paints this incredibly vivid, almost cinematic scene to kick off chapter 3.
It's a great scene.
It is. So it is 4:12 a.m. Most of the world is dead asleep, but 8 is standing alone in his darkened global command center. He is staring up at this massive digital projection of his firm's global supply chain.
Yeah.
And the map is just bleeding.
Red everywhere.
Yeah, red indicator lights are pulsing aggressively across the European and Asian logistics corridors. The telemetrics are signaling total, cascading gridlock at 3 of his major international ports.
It is a macroscopic logistical heart attack happening in real time.
And the text details how 8 is reading through these emergency memos sent by his global suppliers and his regional directors. And what is maddening, which just drives him crazy, is that they're all sending identical, highly sanitized updates.
Right. Nobody wants to take the blame.
Nobody is saying, we failed to load the ships because our management structure is broken. Instead, they are blaming the massive delays on things like macroeconomic headwinds, unprecedented cyclical troughing, and transitory supply chain frictions.
And right there, we see the lingering toxic legacy of that semantic void we discussed in part 2.
It's infuriating. Think about the word headwinds. It is such a soft, palliative, completely passive word.
It absolves them of responsibility.
Exactly. It makes it sound like a gentle breeze is just temporarily slowing down the sailboats, and if management just waits a little bit, the weather will clear up and everything will be fine.
But 8 looks at these memos and instantly recognizes the lie.
Right.
He realizes that the architects of modern commerce, his own highly paid directors, are entirely devoid of the vocabulary required to describe physical reality.
It's a defensive mechanism, right?
It is. And if we connect this to the broader macroscopic picture, this isn't just a problem with 8's regional suppliers. Turn on any financial broadcast right now.
Everywhere.
Read any central bank charter or quarterly earnings report, and the language is uniformly soft and entirely disconnected from physical laws. Economists constantly speak of the economy cooling down or taking a breath.
Yeah, like it's a marathon runner getting a sip of water.
Exactly. They treat economic stagnation as a temporary weather pattern, a natural cyclical trough. They operate on the fundamental assumption that the global market will naturally recover its momentum once interest rates are marginally adjusted or some minor fiscal policy is tweaked.
But Hypothermia says that is a fundamental, catastrophic misdiagnosis of the patient.
It is entirely wrong. The global economy is not experiencing a cyclical slowdown. It is not catching its breath. According to the strict thermodynamic diagnostic we are applying today, the global economy is approaching a state of terminal thermodynamic heat death.
Heat death. Wow. That is a terrifying phrase, usually reserved for astrophysicists talking about the end of the universe.
Right, the final state of maximum entropy.
Let's really unpack the physics of that for the listener. How does a human economy experience a heat death?
Well, to truly understand this mechanism, leadership has to stop viewing the market as a collection of sociological trends or, a series of psychological consumer behaviors. They have to start viewing it as an open-dissipative structure.
An open-dissipative structure.
Yes. This is a concept pioneered by the physical chemist and Nobel laureate Ilya Prigogine, and it is absolutely foundational to understanding why anything in the universe, whether it's a single cell, a storm, or a massive corporation, survives or fails.
Okay, I want to make sure this is crystal clear because it sounds like really dense textbook material, but it's actually incredibly practical. Let's define an open dissipative structure for the listener. What does that actually look like in the physical world?
At its core, an open dissipative structure is any complex system that maintains its highly organized structured state by continuously importing free energy from its environment.
Okay, so it pulls energy in.
Right. It utilizes that energy to perform internal work, and then it continuously exports entropy or waste heat back out into the environment.
So it's essentially an engine that has to breathe.
Exactly. Let's look at biology. A biological organism is a dissipative structure.
That makes sense.
You eat food, which is importing free, highly ordered chemical energy. Your body processes that caloric energy to maintain your cellular structure, to pump blood, to move muscles.
And that's the internal work.
Yes. And as a byproduct of that work, you radiate body heat into the air, and you expel physical waste. You import order and you export disorder. If you stop doing either of those things, you die.
I've also heard this applied to weather systems, right? Like storms.
Yeah, a hurricane is a massive, visible, open, dissipative structure.
Oh, that's a great example.
A hurricane survives by pulling in immense thermal energy from the warm ocean surface. It uses that heat energy to organize massive, highly structured kinetic wind patterns, and then it survives by venting the cold, exhausted, high-entropy air out the top of the storm into the upper atmosphere.
Whoa, okay.
If the hurricane moves over cold water, cutting off its energy input, or if upper-level winds prevent it from venting its exhaust, the structure collapses.
It just falls apart.
Exactly, and crucially, a massive multinational corporation operates on these exact same physical laws. It is an open, dissipative structure.
So what did the human body, a Category 5 hurricane, and a $40 billion logistics firm all have in common?
They all exist in states very far from thermodynamic equilibrium. Their survival relies entirely on constant, dynamic, unyielding energy flow. They are not resting.
They're violently processing energy.
Yes, violently and continuously processing energy. A healthy corporate structure takes in raw materials, venture capital, human talent, and electricity. It metabolizes those inputs to generate mechanical output. It moves physical products across an ocean. It writes functional software that solves a problem. It erects buildings. And ideally, it exports its entropy.
Wait, okay, how does a company export entropy? I get how a person sweats or a hurricane vents air, but what does corporate exhaust look like?
Corporate exhaust, that entropy is obsolete code, broken processes, failed product lines, and frankly, misaligned personnel. A healthy company actively vents its entropy by deprecating old software, shutting down failing divisions, streamlining bloated workflows, and firing toxic or underperforming leaders. It pushes the disorder out of the system.
But here's the critical vulnerability of the open dissipative structure.
Yeah.
And this is where we start to see the $9.6 trillion leak.
Yes. Because when the system becomes saturated with internal entropy, when the structural resistance, the layers of bureaucracy, the useless alignment meetings, the internal political friction inside the machine grows larger than the energy being pumped into it, it loses the capacity to do actual kinetic work.
It just spins its wheels.
Exactly. The company stops being able to move the needle. In classical thermodynamics, the absolute measure of a system's ability to perform useful work is known as exergy.
Exergy. We touched on this briefly in our previous deep dive. It's essentially the extractable, useful, kinetic potential of a system.
Right.
It's the part of the energy that actually does the job, as opposed to the energy that just turns into useless heat.
Precisely. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that raw energy cannot be created or destroyed. It is always conserved.
We all learned that in high school physics.
Right. But the second law of thermodynamics dictates that exergy, the usefulness of that energy, can be utterly destroyed by systemic friction. When a system's exergy drops to zero, when it can no longer convert incoming energy into forward spatial displacement or meaningful innovation, the system has reached heat death.
So Hatuna's diagnosis of the global market is that we are not experiencing a gentle, cyclical slowdown. We are suffocating on our own internal entropy because we stopped venting it.
We are approaching a state where massive, unimaginable volumes of capital are being burned, but absolutely no kinetic work is being produced.
Think about the macroeconomic environment over the last decade, specifically the era of massive quantitative easing.
Oh, it was a perfect storm for entropy.
Trillions of dollars of effectively free energy were continuously injected into the global corporate system by central banks. Startups were raising hundreds of millions of dollars without a viable product.
Just burning cash.
Yeah. At the same time, human resource departments relentlessly expanded corporate headcounts, adding tens of thousands of employees to tech firms and logistics networks. The corporate machine was running white hot.
It was consuming vast amounts of fuel and generating massive amounts of heat, but the mechanical gears were refusing to turn. The global rate of productivity growth flatlined. The exergy was plummeting, even as the energy input was at an all-time high.
I really want you, the listener, to pause whatever you are doing right now and think about your own company. Think about your specific division or your daily workflow.
Look at the sheer amount of money being spent around you.
On payroll, on massive enterprise software subscriptions, on external consulting fees. Now think about the massive thermal heat generated by your day-to-day operations.
The back-to-back synchronous video meetings where nothing is decided.
Oh man, the endless recursive Slack threads that branch off into 50 different conversations. The mandatory approval chains that require 6 different signatures to launch a minor software patch.
Ask yourself, are the mechanical gears of your company actually turning?
Are you shipping products faster than you were 3 years ago? Are you innovating at a higher velocity? Or are you just suffocating on your own internal entropy, burning millions of dollars just to stay in the exact same place?
It is a profound, deeply uncomfortable question. And it requires abandoning the soft sciences to answer it honestly. Because if a management theory, no matter how popular or well-intentioned, contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, it will inevitably mathematically collapse.
And that brings us to the core illusion we have to shatter today. The hallucination of stability.
This transition in the text is brilliant because it moves from macro theory right down to the ground floor.
Right. We move the timeline forward. It's now 10 a.m. on that same chaotic day with CEO 8.
He's been up since before 4.
Yeah, he has left his dark global command center and has flown out to conduct a surprise physical audit of a massive regional routing hub in Munich, Germany. And he meets with the regional director of the facility.
And what's crucial to note is the disposition of this director. He is not stressed. He is thrilled.
He's beaming.
He is beaming with pride because, according to everything he has been taught by modern management science, he believes he has built the ultimate modern workplace.
Right. The director confidently walks 8 through the facility and shows him in the internal HR dashboard. And the metrics on this dashboard are flawless.
Oh, they look perfect on paper.
Employee satisfaction is sitting at a staggering 98%. Voluntary turnover is effectively 0. Nobody wants to leave this hub. Workloads have been perfectly equitably distributed across the entire floor, so no single employee feels overwhelmed.
There are no reported operational bottlenecks, no interpersonal conflicts in the HR logs.
And the director proudly looks at 8 and tells him that he has successfully engineered a perfectly balanced, stress-free culture.
It sounds like an absolute utopia. It is exactly the environment that every single management textbook from the year 2010 onwards told us we needed to build.
The holy grail of human resources.
But 8 doesn't smile. He doesn't congratulate the man.
Nope. He completely ignores the glowing HR dashboard, and he pulls up the raw mechanical throughput data. He looks at the actual volume of freight moving through the building.
And here's the brutal punchline of the scene.
8 looks at the data and sees that the volume output at the Munich hub has completely flatlined.
For 14 consecutive months.
14 months. The facility has not generated a single percentage point of growth. It isn't scaling its operations. It isn't innovating new routing methods. It isn't capturing new market share from competitors.
It is merely existing.
The director genuinely believed he had engineered operational perfection. But 8 realized the man had engineered a morgue.
A utopian morgue.
It's Utopian Morgue, exactly.
And this raises an incredibly important question that flies in the face of modern corporate dogma. Why does perfect comfort result in 0 growth? Why did a 98% satisfaction rate yield 0 innovation?
This is where we have to translate the HR goal into strict physics.
Let's do it. The ultimate, explicitly stated objective of modern human resources is absolute stability. They want to eliminate friction, eradicate stress, ensure workloads are perfectly flat, and guarantee the workforce is perfectly comfortable. But if you look at thermodynamics, if you have a closed system where the temperature and the pressure are perfectly uniform and balanced across the entire volume,
that state has a specific name.
yes, it is called thermal equilibrium.
And as we established with the hypothermia metaphor at the opening of this deep dive to the untrained eye, thermal equilibrium looks like peace.
Yeah.
The system is completely calm. The shivering is stopped.
But to a physicist, Thermal equilibrium is mathematically synonymous with death.
Precisely. Because absolutely zero kinetic work can be extracted from a system in perfect equilibrium. You cannot power a machine with a room where the air is all exactly 72 degrees.
Let's break down the underlying physics of why that is. Work, and I mean work in the physical sense, whether that is the actual movement of cargo mass in a warehouse, the creation of a complex new software architecture, or the generation of financial momentum in a market, requires a strict differential.
It requires a gradient.
It requires a high-pressure zone interacting with a low-pressure zone.
You cannot have flow without a gradient.
Exactly. Let's look at fluid dynamics. Flow only occurs when there is a pressure gradient. A pressure gradient is a physical quantity that describes the rate and direction at which pressure changes around a specific location.
Okay, so a difference in pressure.
If there is no pressure gradient, if the pressure is identical everywhere, air does not move, water does not flow, nothing happens, the system is dead.
This connects perfectly to the Bernoulli equation.
Yes, exactly. According to the Bernoulli principle, the internal energy of static pressure must be converted into the kinetic energy of bulk fluid motion. You have to trade pressure for speed.
Let's use a tangible analogy for that. An airplane wing.
Perfect example.
An airplane wing generates absolutely zero lift if the pressure on the top of the wing is identical to the pressure on the bottom. If the pressure is equal, the plane just stays on the runway.
Right, it doesn't move.
Yeah. To generate the massive lift required to rip a 400-ton machine into the sky and defeat gravity, the wing is precisely shaped to create a severe pressure differential. A fast-moving, low-pressure zone on top and a slower, high-pressure zone on the bottom.
The airplane only flies because it creates a violent imbalance in the air around it.
Oh, I love that. And if I can throw in an original analogy here, let's take it from the sky down to the ground. Let's look at a Formula One race car.
Oh, okay. Let's hear it.
A Formula One car generates absolutely no aerodynamic downforce like. It cannot corner at 180 miles per hour without flying off the track unless it uses massive Venturi tunnels under the chassis.
Ground effect.
Exactly. Those tunnels create a massive, violent, low-pressure vacuum that physically sucks the vehicle to the asphalt. The car relies on severe pressure differentials to survive the corners. If you equalize the pressure under the car, it crashes.
That is a perfect translation of the concept. The physical laws governing these machines are universal. Forward momentum requires a gradient, and this applies directly to human organization.
Growth, innovation, and velocity in a corporation are not spontaneous organic phenomena that just happen because people feel happy and well-rested in a lounge.
No, they are the direct mechanical result of engineered pressure gradients.
Let's stick with the Formula One analogy for a second, because I know the text uses the F1 pit stop as the ultimate masterclass example of applying pressure gradients to human organization.
It's an incredible operational model.
Think about watching a modern F1 pit stop. It is staggering. It almost defies belief. The system is constrained by brutal, unyielding parameters.
A crew of 20 human beings must remove 4 blistering hot tires, attach 4 new tires, adjust the aerodynamic flaps, and release the car in under 2.0 seconds.
It is the absolute definition of maximum kinetic output. It is pure exergy.
And to achieve that mind-bending velocity, the team principle does not optimize for comfort. They don't set up the pit box to be a relaxing environment.
No. Every single fraction of a second in that pit lane is a high-pressure zone. That severe gradient forces total, ruthless operational alignment.
Now, let's play out a hypothetical. Imagine if the team principal walked into the garage before the race and said, "You know what, guys? I've been reading some new HR literature. I'm going to prioritize the psychological safety and work-life balance of the pit crew over the speed of the tire change today."
I don't want anyone feeling overwhelmed.
Right. Take your time, center yourselves, make sure you feel equitable about who carries the heavy tires, don't feel stressed. What physically happens to the system?
The pressure gradient completely collapses.
Yeah.
The differential drops to zero.
Exactly. The pit crew relaxes. The pit stop, instead of taking 1.9 seconds, takes 10 seconds.
And in Formula One, a 10-second pit stop means the race is mathematically lost. The exergy evaporates, the kinetic potential is destroyed by comfort.
So we must ask, what does a pressure gradient look like in a standard corporate office setting?
Right, because we aren't changing tires.
No. In an office, it is a rigid structural constraint. It is a hard, unyielding, seemingly impossible deadline. It is a state of severe competitive urgency or a strict limitation on available capital and resources.
It is the absolute differential between the current inadequate state of your product and the required elevated state of your survival in the market.
If you remove those gradients, if you insulate your teams from that market pressure, if you give them unlimited timelines and infinite budgets, the system naturally relaxes.
It expands to fill the void.
It settles into that cozy, warm, thermal equilibrium.
And here is the truly terrifying warning Hatunen gives us about macroeconomic systems that are allowed to rest in equilibrium for too long. You can't just lightly nudge them back into gear when you suddenly need them.
No, you absolutely cannot. When a massive macro system is allowed to rest in a state of high-entropy thermal equilibrium for an extended period, the underlying structure actually becomes brittle.
The organizational muscle atrophies.
It stagnates. And eventually, the external environment, which is never at equilibrium, will force that brittle system to undergo a violent phase transition.
A phase transition, let's make sure that's clear. You mean like water boiling?
Exactly. In physics, a phase transition is the sudden macroscopic structural alteration of a material state. It is liquid water violently flashing into expanding steam when it hits 100 degrees Celsius, or liquid metal rapidly snapping into a rigid solid lattice as it cools.
It is a sudden, fundamental change in the rules governing the matter.
In macroeconomics, a phase transition doesn't look like steam. It looks like systemic collapse. It manifests as a massive wave of sudden bankruptcies, forced corporate liquidations, hyperinflationary restructuring, or the sudden, desperate privatization of sovereign assets.
Because you cannot outwork physics. You can only operate within its constraints. If you, as an executive or a middle manager, successfully optimize your corporate system for absolute frictionless comfort, you are mathematically optimizing for zero output.
And zero output in a highly competitive, high-pressure global market inevitably, unavoidably triggers a phase transition. You go bankrupt. Your company ceases to exist in its current form.
Which brings us to the actual telemetry of this heat death. We spent a lot of time establishing the theoretical physical laws, but we need to prove that this is happening right now, in the real world, at a global scale.
We need to look at the thermometers.
Exactly. And this takes us seamlessly back to CEO 8. It's now 6:30 a.m. on a Thursday, a few days after the Munich audit.
Right.
8 is sitting in a boardroom back at corporate headquarters, and he is watching his chief HR officer deliver a presentation. The HR chief is trying to explain a massive company-wide stagnation in warehouse throughput.
And they have a slide deck blaming the drop in productivity on quiet quitting, shifting generational values, and post-pandemic malaise.
It is sociological alchemy masking mechanical failure.
Exactly. And 8 just cuts the presentation off mid-sentence. He refuses to listen to it. He says, this is not an HR problem. We do not need a wellness seminar. This is a thermodynamic catastrophe.
We do not need to guess at the sociological state of the system. The instruments are already reading the temperature of the machine, and he pulls up and projects the raw data from the 2025 Gallup State of the Global Workplace Report.
This is a brilliant analytical move in the text because this is where we translate standard sociological survey data directly into physical thermodynamic states.
According to the 2025 Gallup report, the global corporate machine is operating with devastating, almost fatal internal friction.
Let's break down the 3 distinct cohorts of the global workforce identified by Gallup, but let's view them strictly through the lens of thermodynamics.
Okay, let's start with the first cohort. And what's immediately shocking is that this is the absolute minority of the workforce. According to Gallup, only 21% of the global workforce is actually engaged in their work.
In our physical framework, this 21% possesses exergy. They are the kinetic engine of the economy.
Just 21%?
Yes. This incredibly small fraction of the population acts as the sole thermodynamic engine of the entire global structure. They are the only nodes in the corporate network operating across pressure gradients.
They are the ones actually taking raw capital, time, and material, absorbing the stress of the gradient, and converting it into useful kinetic work.
Wait, I really want to emphasize that. Are you saying that every ounce of innovation, every unit of scaled growth, every single marginal dollar of corporate profit generated anywhere on Earth is produced exclusively by this 21%?
That is the mathematical reality of the data. The rest of the system is either inert or actively resisting.
And what is truly alarming is when you break down that 21% by operational tier. The Gallup data shows that globally, only 27% of managers operate with high exergy.
Why is that specific metric, the manager exergy, so critical to the failure of the system?
Because in an organizational structure, managers are the conduits. They are the physical plumbing.
Like pipes.
They are the mechanical pipe through which the executive pressure gradients, the urgency, the deadlines, the vision are distributed down to the frontline workers who actually move the mass.
Right.
If the manager has settled into thermal equilibrium, if the pipe is clogged with comfort, or if they're just trying to protect their team from all stress, the pressure gradient from the CEO never reaches the warehouse floor or the engineering bay.
The pressure drops to zero inside the middle management layer, and the corporate engine violently stalls. The CEO can scream all they want, but the transmission is broken.
That is a terrifying image.
So that 21% is the engine. Now let's look at the massive chunk of the pie chart, the 62%.
This is the bulk of it.
Gallup classifies a staggering 62% of the global workforce as not engaged. The media colloquially calls them quiet quitters. HR departments treat this massive block of people as having an attitude problem.
They try to fix it with better office snacks, mandatory wellness seminars, and endless employee engagement surveys.
But Hutunen reframes this completely. In physics, an attitude cannot stop an engine. Physical mass stops an engine. This 62% is not an attitude problem. They are thermal mass.
Thermal mass. Okay, explain that. Like a giant block of concrete.
Literally, yes.
Yeah.
In structural engineering and building physics, a thermal mass is a heavy, dense material like thick concrete, dense clay, or a heavy stone that possesses a high heat capacity.
It absorbs and stores immense amounts of heat energy without actually doing anything with it.
Right. It provides immense structural inertia. A massive concrete wall dampens temperature swings, it resists rapid structural change, and it severely delays the transmission of thermal energy through a building.
So when we apply the physics of concrete to the corporate organizational chart, these 62% of workers are the literal thermal mass of the enterprise. They are mechanically inert.
Yes. They show up to the office, they log into the VPN, and they absorb vast, unimaginable amounts of organizational energy capital, wages, healthcare benefits, and massive amounts of management time. But they produce absolutely zero forward momentum.
They act as biological circuit breakers, cooling down the system and preventing the kinetic engine from running hot.
Okay, let's play this out with a real-world hypothetical to make sure the listener really grasps how deadly this is. Let's imagine a CEO attempts to initiate a rapid, necessary strategic pivot.
Let's call it Project Phoenix.
Perfect. Project Phoenix. The market has shifted, and the company needs to launch a new software product line in 6 weeks, or they lose massive market share. The CEO applies a massive pressure gradient. They inject high exergy into the system. What happens when that directive hits the 62%?
The 62% act as a massive, immovable heat sink. The kinetic energy of Project Phoenix hits that layer of management and workers, and it is instantly absorbed and dissipated.
They don't actively say no, right?
Yeah. No, they don't actively rebel. Instead, they schedule endless hour-long alignment meetings about the project. They start massive, branching Slack threads asking for minor clarifications on the font choices.
They insist on waiting for a consensus that never comes.
And over the course of 4 weeks, they completely dissipate the energy of the pivot into the void. The initiative dies not from active, malicious sabotage, but from thermal absorption. The concrete absorbs the heat, and the room stays cold.
That is such a recognizable scenario for anyone who has worked in a large corporation. And what's deeply concerning is the demographic trend of this thermal mass.
Yes, the text points out a terrifying demographic collapse hidden in the data.
Between 2020 and 2025, the youngest cohorts of workers experienced catastrophic drops in exergy. Generation Z and younger millennials dropped by 8 points in engagement, and older millennials dropped by 9 points.
Which means the exact generation tasked with inheriting the global economic engine over the next 20 years is rapidly solidifying into inert concrete.
However, it is vital to understand what we in the field call the engineer's advantage.
Okay, what's the engineer's advantage?
A massive, sluggish system, whether it's an entire Scandinavian nation or a bloated middle management tier in a Fortune 500 company, is not a lost cause. To a thermodynamic architect, it is actually a dream job site.
Wait, a dream job site? I mean, a bloated, heavily indebted system full of inert thermal mass sounds like an absolute turnaround nightmare.
It's a dream because the capacity is already physically present.
Oh.
The human infrastructure exists as thermal mass. You do not need to go out into the open market, raise huge amounts of capital, and build a brand new engine from scratch.
Yeah.
The inert material is sitting right there. It simply needs a strict pressure gradient to activate it.
Right.
If you strip away the artificial heat sinks, if you remove the debt subsidies and those insulated layers of bureaucracy and introduce a strict, performance-based differential, that dormant mass can violently snap back into generating kinetic work. The energy is trapped. It just requires a gradient to release it.
Okay, I follow the logic perfectly. The thermal mass is growing denser.
Which leaves us with the final cohort, the 17%. Gallup defines them as actively disengaged.
And in physics, this cohort is classified as active friction.
Right. They aren't just concrete, they're sand in the gears.
Correct. They do not merely passively absorb energy like the thermal mass. They actively, purposefully resist the kinetic engine. They generate severe parasitic drag.
They sabotage processes, they hoard vital information, they erode structural integrity by fostering toxic internal politics.
And they create massive aerodynamic turbulence that destroys the flow of the entire enterprise. And this right here is where legacy management theory truly drives me crazy.
How so?
Because what does traditional HR do when they identify this 17%? They try to coach them.
Oh, the performance improvement plans.
Yes. They put them on PIPs that take 6 months to resolve. They send them to conflict resolution seminars. They sit them down to try to find the root of their unhappiness.
It's madness.
It is. Think about it this way. If you are building a high-performance race engine and you find a gear that is warped and grinding violently against the other gears, creating massive parasitic friction, you don't pour more expensive oil on it and hope it heals.
No, you don't.
Or if an arborist looks at a massive oak tree and sees a rotting, diseased branch that is actively draining nutrients from the trunk and threatening to infect the rest of the tree, they don't try to nurture the rot. They cleanly and efficiently prune the dead branch so the rest of the organism can survive.
Pruning the dead branch is the exact mathematical protocol required by the physics of the system.
Exactly.
Friction cannot be negotiated with. It must be excised. If you leave it in place, it will continue to degrade the available exergy until the entire system just stalls completely.
Right.
And, what makes this three-part stratification, the 21% exergy, the 62% thermal mass, and the 17% friction even more alarming, is the structural degradation happening specifically within the managerial layer of these companies.
The managers, the structural struts of the company.
Yes.
They are the ones who are supposed to be holding the whole thing together, right?
Precisely. Managers act as the vital thermal conduits of the enterprise. The executive level sets the strategy and generates the high-pressure gradient, but it is the manager's job to actually transmit that pressure gradient down through the layers of the organization to the individual nodes on the front lines.
Right. They are the pipes carrying the pressure.
But according to the global telemetry, manager engagement has plummeted to just 27%.
Just 27.
Yes. That means the central load-bearing columns of the global enterprise are actively buckling.
Let's visualize what that means mechanically for a second. If the manager is existing in thermal equilibrium, if they themselves have slipped into that 62% cohort and become inert thermal mass, then the high-pressure gradient from the executive level hits that manager and just stops.
It's completely absorbed.
Right. It gets absorbed by the concrete. The urgency, the strategic vision, the demand for excellence. It never actually reaches the warehouse floor or the engineering bay. The pressure drops to absolute zero halfway down the pipe, and the engine stalls out.
And that is the exact mechanism of a macroscopic collapse. The executives sitting at the top believe they are applying pressure, but because the conduits are blocked by thermal mass, the frontline nodes feel absolutely nothing. The system fractures.
Wow.
I want the listener to visualize the sheer physical impossibility of what we are asking the global economy to do. Think about the aerodynamic impossibility of achieving escape velocity, of getting a massive heavy lift rocket off the launch pad and into orbit when 79% of the rocket's mass is either dead concrete weight or actively deploying parachutes to create friction.
The global machine is operating with 4/5 of its mass actively preventing forward motion. It is a miracle anything gets built at all.
And that brings us back to the core mission objective of this deep dive. The financial destruction caused by this thermodynamic state is staggering. The macroeconomic utility analysis provided by Houghton reveals that this thermal decay costs the world economy hundreds of billions in lost productivity annually.
But the true measure isn't just the loss, it's the opportunity cost. If leadership could reverse this, if we could somehow convert that 62% thermal mass and the 17% active friction back into kinetic engines, the data estimates that $9.6 trillion in real kinetic productivity could be added to the global economy.
A dormant 9% of global GDP, just sitting there.
Completely paralyzed.
Yeah.
Because corporate leadership refuses to apply the necessary strict pressure gradients to force the structure out of thermal equilibrium.
Okay, so we've firmly established the micromechanics. We see how it destroys a single company or a logistics hub. But Hutunen scales this analysis up to a staggering degree. He proves that these thermodynamic laws don't just govern corporate supply chains. They govern entire sovereign nations.
Which brings us to the macro case study, the Finnish heat death.
Now, before we dive into this specific macro analysis, we need to pause and establish a very clear framework for how we are discussing this. This is crucial for you, the listener, to understand so we don't lose the thread of the physics.
Yes, very important.
I want to be abundantly clear. We are absolutely not taking a political stance here. Physics is entirely agnostic to human politics. We are not sitting here judging the moral, ethical, or sociological validity of the Scandinavian welfare state.
We are diagnosing structural mechanics, not debating social policies. We are looking at inputs, outputs, and entropy.
Exactly. We are strictly mathematically observing the physical consequences of a macroscopic system that has been explicitly legally optimized for maximum human comfort at the expense of thermodynamic pressure. So with that framework in mind, let's set the scene.
It is 1:34 p.m. Eastern European summertime. CEO 8 has flown from Munich and lands in Kuopio, a city in the North Savo region of Finland.
He is auditing a massive regional logistics hub there that has been hemorrhaging capital for 5 consecutive quarters. He gets off the plane, walks into the facility, and the regional director greets him.
And this director is exuding this aura of absolute Zen-like calm.
The director proudly touts the facility's localized metrics. 0 employee turnover in 3 years, incredibly generous shared parental leave policies, a strictly enforced 35-hour work week, and a globally celebrated standard of psychological safety.
It is the exact same dynamic as the Munich hub. The director believes he has achieved perfection.
Exactly. 8 pulls the historical throughput data and sees that the Kuopio facility hasn't generated a single percentage point of real volumetric growth in a decade.
It is completely stagnant.
The local director thought he was running a progressive, enlightened utopia. 8 realized he was standing inside a sovereign-scale morgue.
To truly observe what happens when a massive human system optimizes entirely for thermal equilibrium, we have to zoom out and look at the Republic of Finland over the last 15 years.
From a sociological standpoint, Finland has been crowned the happiest country in the world by the UN World Happiness Report for 9 consecutive years.
The global media apparatus constantly praises their robust social safety net and work-life balance as the absolute utopian ideal for human existence.
But applying the unforgiving framework of organizational multiphysics reveals a chilling reality beneath that happiness score. The happiest nation on Earth is a system dying of thermodynamic stagnation.
The raw economic data is stark and undeniable. You have to ask the question, how does a nation win the global happiness crown for a decade while simultaneously suffering through 15 years of virtually zero economic growth?
Since the 2008 global financial crisis, and specifically following the collapse of Nokia's hardware dominance, Finland's macroeconomic engine completely flatlined.
Between 2011 and the mid-2020s, their cumulative economic growth was a dismal 7%. Real GDP repeatedly stalled or actively contracted.
And when you look at the mechanics of how that happened, the root cause was a total collapse in private sector productivity, specifically high exergy tech productivity.
The growth in employment over that lost decade wasn't driven by software engineering, advanced manufacturing, or disruptive startups. It was driven almost entirely by the public sector.
Specifically what they call the SOTI Reform Health and Social Services.
And here is the unyielding physical constraint of that shift. It is mathematically impossible to scale labor productivity in manual, human-to-human care work at the velocity of software.
Right. A nurse or a social worker, no matter how dedicated, can only physically care for so many patients in a day. The output is strictly linearly bound by human biology and time.
A software engineer, however, can write a piece of code that scales to 1 billion users instantly with near zero marginal cost. By shifting the bulk of its employment growth to low-velocity, high-maintenance care work, the exergy of the entire Finnish macroeconomy was crushed.
But Huntington argues it goes much deeper than just a sector shift. It's about the fundamental psychological and physical environment of the population.
Historically, the Finnish national identity was defined by this incredible, deeply respected concept called sisu.
Sisu. It loosely translates to extraordinary resilience, grit, and unyielding inner strength in the face of brutal, unforgiving adversity.
In our physics framework, sisu is the psychological manifestation of operating across extreme pressure gradients. It is the human ability to generate immense kinetic output when placed in a high-pressure, freezing, hostile environment. It is survival exergy.
But the architecture of the modern welfare state completely eradicated those pressure gradients.
By meticulously insulating the entire population from almost all forms of severe economic adversity, by guaranteeing baseline income, housing, healthcare, and education entirely independent of an individual's mechanical output, the differential between success and stagnation shrank to zero.
They successfully engineered perfect thermal equilibrium.
From a thermodynamic perspective, there is no high-pressure zone forcing massive disruptive innovation, and there is no low-pressure vacuum of poverty sucking the system forward out of desperation. There is only a flat, comfortable, incredibly inert equilibrium.
Okay, but I have to ask the obvious question here, and I'm sure the listener is wondering the exact same thing. If the Finnish system is mathematically failing, if economic growth is dead and productivity is flatlined, why does the data mathematically declare them the happiest people on Earth year after year?
How can a physically failing system produce such consistently happy humans?
Yeah, exactly.
That is the exact paradox, and it raises a critical concept from advanced systems theory: informational entropy.
Informational entropy.
When the metrics used to evaluate a system become fundamentally disconnected from the physical reality of the system's actual survival, you have deeply corrupted data. The happiness index, in this specific thermodynamic context, is a corrupted beta signal.
Explain how that corruption happens mechanically.
When people are perfectly insulated from stress, anxiety, and pressure by massive public borrowing, they will naturally report exceptionally high levels of comfort and happiness on a sociological survey.
Sure, they feel fine.
But you have to look at the fuel source. That comfort is not financed by exergy. It is not financed by kinetic economic growth. It is financed entirely by debt.
Finland ran chronic structural deficits for 15 consecutive years to maintain that baseline of comfort.
Their sovereign debt-to-GDP ratio surged from a highly manageable 35% in the early 2000s to a massive 89% by 2025, and it was headed to a mathematically unsustainable 96% by 2030.
So the happiness isn't generated by real sustainable energy, to use a brutal astral metaphor from the text. Happiness in this context is just a temporary thermal warmth generated by systematically burning the structural furniture to heat the house.
Eventually, you run out of chairs.
Exactly. And we saw the breaking point, the massive Sote crisis in 2026, where roughly 70,000 healthcare and social welfare employees resigned or went on strike because of crushing workloads and underfunding, occurred because the Utopian Morgue eventually exceeded its biological and financial tolerance.
You cannot borrow against the strict laws of thermodynamics forever. Eventually, the bond markets, the currency valuations, and the external environment will force a violent phase transition.
Okay, so we've looked at the micro level in Munich and the macro level in Finland. We see the symptoms of the heat death everywhere. Now, the critical pivot. We know comfort kills the engine. So how do we actually fix it? How does a leader introduce survival friction back into the machine?
This brings us to executive action and the concept of engineering beneficial constraints.
We are back in Kuopio. It is 2 p.m. on the day of the audit. CEO 8 is standing in front of his failing regional leadership team in a stark conference room.
These directors are expecting a soft, collaborative presentation on culture building and team synergy.
Instead, 8 bypasses the HR slides entirely. He turns on the projector, and he projects a highly detailed schematic of an internal combustion chamber on the wall.
I love this moment. It is so jarring.
8 looks at this room full of comfortable executives and says, "You have spent the last 5 years trying to make this workforce comfortable. Total comfort equals thermal equilibrium. Thermal equilibrium equals heat death. My responsibility as your chief executive is not your psychological safety.
My responsibility is to artificially introduce, manage, and optimize pressure gradients."
This specific philosophy aligns perfectly with the work of the renowned economic sociologist Wolfgang Streeck. Streeck introduced the concept of beneficial constraints.
He proved through rigorous analysis that an economy, a corporation, or any organizational structure actually performs significantly better and innovates faster when strict, unyielding limitations are placed upon it.
It makes perfect physical sense when you think about it practically. Let's look at engineering. You cannot channel high-velocity water without the unyielding, rigid constraint of a physical pipe.
If you just pour thousands of gallons of water on the floor, it spreads out, loses all its kinetic energy, and stops. It just makes a puddle.
You cannot generate the massive directional thrust required to lift a rocket without the explosive, unyielding confinement of a titanium combustion chamber. Without the rigid walls of the chamber forcing the energy downward, you don't have a rocket engine, you just have a massive, uncontained bonfire.
The constraint is what creates the velocity. So the practical question becomes, how does an executive actually build that combustion chamber inside a modern office?
Huttunen provides a brutal, highly effective, 5-step thermodynamic constraint algorithm.
It is adapted from aerospace engineering protocols and Dr. Eliyahu M. Goldratt's famous theory of constraints. And it is critical to note that these 5 steps must be executed strictly in sequential order.
Okay, let's break this down for the listener step by step, because this is the actionable playbook. Step 1, challenge requirements.
This is a rule pulled straight from modern aerospace engineering. Make your requirements less dumb.
I love that phrasing.
Before you apply any pressure to a system, you have to ensure the task you are demanding is actually grounded in physical reality and market necessity. You must aggressively interrogate and erase legacy best practices.
If a requirement, a meeting, or a report exists just because that's how we've always done it, and it lacks absolute verifiable physical necessity, it is dumb. Delete the requirement.
I think of Elon Musk constantly talking about this with SpaceX. If a part doesn't need to exist, don't engineer a better version of it. Just delete the part.
Which leads perfectly into step 2. Delete parts and processes.
Once you've challenged the requirements, you have to surgically excise the inert thermal mass from your organization. You cannot fix a slow, high-entropy organization by adding more oversight programs.
The natural corporate bias is always additive. We had a mistake, let's add a new QA step. Or let's form a committee just in case.
That additive instinct is exactly how entropy accumulates and turns into concrete. You must relentlessly strip out redundant approval chains, kill zombie projects, and remove middle management layers that merely pass data back and forth without acting on it.
Okay, so you've stripped the engine down. Step 3, optimize the constraint. This is where we apply the Goldratt protocol.
The theory of constraints dictates that the ultimate capacity of any open-dissipative structure is strictly limited by its single narrowest point, its primary bottleneck.
If your global supply chain is redlining because of a port delay, but you force your internal marketing team to work 20% faster to launch a campaign, you do not increase overall corporate output.
You just generate massive internal waste heat, burn out the marketing team, and pile up useless inventory. You must identify the primary physical constraint of the organization, and you must ruthlessly subordinate every other department, every other budget to serving and widening that exact bottleneck.
That requires immense discipline because it means telling 90% of the company that their pet projects do not matter right now. Okay, step 4, force velocity.
This is where you introduce the extreme pressure gradient. Time is a physical dimension in organizational physics. Once the system is stripped down and aligned to the bottleneck, you artificially, aggressively steepen the gradient. You cut project timelines arbitrarily by 50%.
A project that takes 6 months when the system is resting in thermal equilibrium will miraculously execute in 6 weeks if the structural survival of the team depends on it. You force the team to abandon perfectionism and innovate through the friction.
And finally, step 5, automate. And the text makes it incredibly clear. You only do this as the absolute last step.
This is where most digital transformations fail. If you apply software automation to a bloated, high-entropy, fundamentally broken process, you do not fix the process. You just generate massive amounts of waste heat much faster.
Software should only be deployed to seal the new, optimized low-entropy state into the engine block after the human optimization is complete.
Okay, I have to jump in here with a massive pushback on behalf of the listener because I am looking at this 5-step algorithm deleting parts, subordinating departments to bottlenecks, cutting timelines by 50%, and my mind immediately goes to the brutal, deeply flawed lean management fads of the 1990s.
Right.
If we need extreme pressure gradients to survive, shouldn't I, as a manager, just fire half my team, strip away all surplus resources, and run the remaining human nodes at 100% theoretical capacity? Isn't that maximum efficiency?
No, absolutely, unequivocally not. Doing that guarantees total, catastrophic, systemic paralysis. This is a critical epistemic boundary we must draw between theoretical mechanics and human reality. Human beings are not theoretical machines. They are fragile biological organisms bound by strict, unforgiving metabolic limits.
Right. Let's talk neurobiology. Explain physically why running an employee at 100% capacity is impossible.
We have to look at the brain as a physical energy sink. The human brain only accounts for about 2% of a person's body weight, but it consumes approximately 20% of the body's resting metabolic energy.
It runs on roughly 20 watts of continuous power.
And a mass portion of that energy is consumed continuously just to maintain basic functional readiness, specifically maintaining the cellular ion gradients across the membranes of neurons.
Wait, cellular ion gradients. Let's translate that. What does that mean?
Think of every neuron in your brain as a tiny, highly charged battery. To keep that battery charged and ready to fire a signal like making a decision or writing a line of code, the cell constantly pumps sodium ions out and potassium ions in.
This pumping process irreversibly consumes cellular ATP, which is the fundamental energy currency of the body.
Because of this massive, non-negotiable biological housekeeping that constantly burns ATP, a human being physically cannot allocate 100% of their time and cognitive energy to external operational execution. The biological overhead is simply too high.
So what is the absolute physical ceiling for a human worker?
True, sustainable practical capacity strictly caps at 80 to 85% utilization.
And what happens if an aggressive executive ignores human biology and forces the system, via those strict deadlines, to 100% utilization anyway?
If you push a network to 100% utilization, you run headfirst into advanced queuing physics, specifically a mathematical principle known as Kingman's formula.
The mathematics of Kingman's formula dictate that as the utilization rate of a node, whether that node is a server or a human employee, approaches 1.0 or 100%, the expected waiting time for a task does not scale linearly. It scales geometrically toward infinity.
Wait, infinity, I need you to explain that. How does being 100% busy result in infinite waiting?
The hidden variable in Kingman's formula is variance.
Yeah.
In any complex system, tasks do not arrive in perfectly spaced, predictable intervals, and they do not take exactly the same amount of time to complete. There is variance.
Let's use a tangible analogy, a busy highway intersection.
If the highway is at 80% utilization, there's a lot of cars, but there is space between them. If one car taps its brakes, a tiny variance, the car behind it slows down, but the gap absorbs the shock. The traffic keeps flowing.
But if that highway is at 100% capacity bumper to bumper, and one single car taps its brakes, the shock wave cannot be absorbed.
It instantly cascades backward, causing a massive traffic jam that can last for hours. In a corporate network, running at 100% capacity ensures that the system completely saturates the moment there is a single unexpected delay.
You replace kinetic throughput with total systemic gridlock. Tasks just sit in digital queues forever because there is absolutely zero bandwidth to process the handoffs.
And this links directly back to our discussion in part 2 about executive burnout. When those digital queues pile up, when an employee opens their laptop and is faced with a mathematically infinite, insurmountable backlog of Slack messages, Jira tickets, and urgent emails, their brain is forced into a state of continuous context thrashing.
Exactly. They are rapidly, desperately switching their cognitive focus between dozens of tasks to try and clear the unyielding queue, but they never have the sustained bandwidth to actually complete one.
And relying on Landauer's principle, which is a principle of physics stating that the act of clearing or overwriting short-term memory irreversibly dissipates heat into the environment. This relentless cognitive context thrashing physically overheats the biological hardware.
You exceed the biological voltage limit. You cause a dielectric breakdown in the employee. The insulation around the wire burns up, the node shorts out, the employee collapses.
Which is exactly why the brutal 5-step constraint algorithm we just discussed must always be balanced with the final absolute rule of organizational thermodynamics, the mandate of strategic slack.
The 15% buffer.
Yes. Executives must manually, purposefully engineer strategic slack into their architecture. You must strictly cap human and systemic utilization below 85%.
I want to address the listener directly here. If you are a manager, a director, or an HR executive, listen to this very closely. This 15% of unallocated bandwidth is not idle waste for you to optimize away. It is not an inefficiency to be solved.
It is a literal, non-negotiable thermodynamic shock absorber.
It is physically required to handle the inevitable cognitive variance, to absorb unexpected macroeconomic shocks, and to prevent the entire corporate network from collapsing into the infinite queuing gridlock of Kingman's formula.
The truly elite executive operates right on the razor's edge. They apply enough severe, unyielding pressure to keep the organization far out of thermal equilibrium, ensuring relentless kinetic output and avoiding the Utopian Morgue. But they possess the absolute, cold operational discipline to leave a 15% thermodynamic buffer.
They push the engine to the absolute limit, but they back off exactly 1 millimeter before the system suffers dialectic breakdown.
It is an incredibly delicate balance. It's not intuitive management. It's literal physics. You either master the gradients or you succumb to the heat death.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today.
And I want to issue a direct challenge to you, the listener. Look at your own organization right now. Look at your department, your startup, your team. Are you managing a utopian morgue?
Look at your team's utilization rates.
If you have optimized them to 100% for maximum efficiency, believing you are extracting every single drop of value out of their day, you haven't built a high-performing team. You have mathematically destroyed your ability to innovate. You have guaranteed gridlock.
This is just the foundation. In our next deep dive, part 4, we are going to dive much deeper into the actual mechanics of exergy. We are going to look at how to systematically dismantle what Huttunen calls the friction factory, exploring the famous Microsoft case study to see how these exact thermodynamic theories were practically applied to turn around a dying tech giant.
It's going to be an incredible continuation of this journey.
We have established today that the thermal equilibrium, total stability, and absolute comfort mathematically guarantee the death of a system.
And we've established that strict pressure gradients, hard constraints, and friction are the only things that generate survival and growth.
Right. The engine needs the spark.
So consider this. Maybe the chronic, relentless anxiety felt by the modern worker, the low-level dread we're all constantly trying to meditate, and therapize away, isn't actually a symptom of a broken corporate machine.
Maybe, in a global economy that is bloated with 62% inert thermal mass, that anxiety is the only remaining friction keeping the system from flatlining entirely.
Are we surviving despite our stress, or are we surviving because of it?
That is a terrifying, profound question to end on.
But to close out today, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Something to really mull over on your commute, or perhaps during your next pointless hour-long alignment meeting.
CEO 8.
Right, so CEO 8, he has this completely absurd epiphany that the number 8, when you lay it on its side, is the infinity symbol.
Which is just wild.
It is. And he takes this delusion a step further. He decides that tapping into this quote-unquote unlimited imagination requires physically mimicking that sideways 8. He rebrands his midday office naps as entering the infinite phase. And that's why he replaces the boardroom chairs with those yoga mats, to maximize his team's infinite potential.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you walk into the boardroom of a $40 billion global logistics conglomerate, but there are no chairs.
Wait, no chairs at all?
0. Instead, the whole executive team is just lying flat on their backs on yoga mats right in the middle of the workday, trying to achieve, infinite potential.
Wow.
Yeah.